12 minutes into the flight, a Boeing 747 with 524 people on board spirals out of control over Japan. A bulkhead in the tail had ruptured, causing overpressurization that severed all 4 hydraulic control lines and blew off part of the tail. With no hydraulic pressure, the captain radioed that the controls were not responding. What caused the tail to explode? And can the pilots bring the damaged plane back to the airport? This is the story of Japan Airlines Flight 123.
Ladies and gentlemen, we do thank you very much for your attention, and now we invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy the takeoff. The captain has made tower communications available, so if you'd like to
Every August, millions of people in Japan celebrate Obon, a holiday where families return to their ancestral homes to honor their forebears. This creates a travel rush, which is both profitable and challenging for Japan's domestic airlines. They need to transport a large portion of the population in just 3 days. In 1985, Obon fell around August 15th, and by the 12th, the travel rush was in full swing. To handle the surge of travelers, Japan Airlines used long-haul aircraft like the Boeing 747 for short domestic flights. One busy route was from Tokyo to Osaka, Japan's second-largest city. Even outside peak times, this route was crowded, and during Obon, it was overwhelmed. One of the many flights between these cities on August 12th was Japan Airlines Flight 123, operated by a Boeing 747 SR, a model designed specifically for JAL's domestic routes. The SR version had a stronger fuselage and tougher landing gear to handle frequent takeoffs, landings, and pressurization cycles. On that day, 509 passengers and 15 crew boarded the Boeing 747 at Tokyo's Haneda Airport. The flight was packed. But what the crew and passengers didn't know was that the aircraft had a hidden critical weakness. This flaw had been growing undetected for years. Just minutes after takeoff, it would reach its breaking point. In the captain's seat was 39-year-old First Officer Yutaka Sasaki. He was in training for promotion to captain and was acting as captain on Flight 123 as part of his final evaluation. He had about 4,000 total flight hours, with around 2,650 of those in the 747. Next to him, supervising, was 49-year-old Captain Masami Takahama, a veteran pilot flying since 1966. Takahama had over 12,000 hours of flight experience and had been flying the 747 for more than a decade. Behind them, at the flight engineer station, was 46-year-old Hiroshi Fukada, with about 9,800 total flight hours and around 3,850 in 747s. Fukada was also a seasoned veteran and had served with the Japan Air Self-Defense Force. This was his 3rd flight on this aircraft that evening. With such an experienced crew, the passengers were in very capable hands. However, the emergencies they would encounter on this flight were unlike anything the crew had ever been trained for. The aircraft took off from runway 15L at Haneda Airport in Tokyo at 6:12 p.m., just 12 minutes behind schedule. The flight to Osaka was a short 54-minute trip, requiring a cruising altitude of 24,000 feet. This altitude was lower than the typical cruising altitude for a Boeing 747, but still created a significant pressure difference between the inside and outside of the plane. Flight 123 climbed out over Tokyo Bay and made a slow right turn toward Osaka. For the first few minutes, everything went smoothly. As the plane climbed, it pressurized. Air from the engines was fed into the cabin, increasing the pressure inside compared to the outside. As the plane ascended and the outside air thinned, the pressure difference grew larger. The thin, aluminum skin of the plane stretched slightly as the air inside pushed against it. This routine process had occurred uneventfully over 12,000 times in the plane's 11-year history. In the cockpit, the flight engineer monitored the cabin pressure to ensure it remained safe for the passengers. However, what no one knew was that the plane's rear bulkhead, an umbrella-shaped structure holding the pressurized air, had a critical flaw. Years earlier, in 1978, the plane had a hard landing in Osaka, causing significant damage to this bulkhead. Although extensive repairs were made, they were not done correctly. As a result, tiny cracks had been growing with each flight. Now, after 12,319 flights and 12 minutes after takeoff, the pressure difference reached a point where the compromised aft pressure bulkhead could no longer hold together. The plane's skin ripped open at the joint between the repaired section and the original bulkhead. In milliseconds, the pressurized cabin air blasted through the gap with tremendous force. The bulkhead shattered into pieces as air rushed into the unpressurized tail section, which wasn't built to handle such pressure. Moments later, a massive section of the tail, including the tail cone, vertical stabilizer, rudder, auxiliary power unit, and other critical parts, was torn off. A loud explosion rocked the plane, and a powerful wind swept loose items like papers and magazines toward the hole as the cabin pressure equalized violently. Near the rear galley, ceiling panels were ripped from their mountings. White fog filled the cabin as water vapor condensed instantly. In the cockpit, the cabin altitude alarm blared, warning the pilots that the air inside was too thin to breathe, but this was just the beginning of their problems. The captain decided to turn back to Tokyo immediately. "Squawk 77, Captain Takahama ordered, switching their transponder to the emergency code 7700. He then radioed Tokyo Air Traffic Control saying, "Tokyo, JL 123, request immediate, trouble. Request return back to Haneda." The controller quickly gave them clearance to turn right. Flight engineer Fukuda noticed an even bigger issue. They were losing hydraulic pressure. The 747 had 4 hydraulic systems, all routed through the tail where most flight controls were located. When the rudder control units and the APU were ripped off, all 4 systems were severed, and hydraulic fluid started leaking. "Hydraulic pressure has dropped," Fukuda warned. First Officer Sasaki struggled to maintain the correct bank angle as they turned back. "Don't turn it so much, it's manual," Captain Takahama urged. "Turn it back." "It doesn't turn back," Sasaki exclaimed. Air traffic controllers saw that Flight 123 was now flying north, only halfway through their turn back to Haneda. The controller asked for the nature of their emergency but received no reply. The flight engineer watched in horror as all hydraulic systems failed. Within seconds, the flight controls were completely ineffective. The captain asked if the hydraulic pressure had truly reached zero, and Fukuda confirmed their worst fears. The loss of hydraulic pressure to the pitch controls caused the plane to enter a phugoid cycle. In this cycle, the plane would descend, gain speed, and then pull up on its own, climbing until it lost speed and descended again. For Flight 123, this resulted in a motion with a 90-second period, varying between 3,000 to 5,000 feet in amplitude, and pitch angles between 15 degrees nose up and 5 degrees nose down. At the same time, losing at least 55% of the vertical stabilizer, including the rudder, caused a Dutch roll. This is when a plane without lateral stabilization starts to fishtail, rolling and yawing side to side. For Flight 123, this meant a 12-second period of rolling 50 degrees to the right, then 50 degrees to the left, repeating over and over. The combined effects of the phugoid and Dutch roll made the plane behave like a ship in a storm, rising and falling, rolling and plunging, swaying back and forth. This wild, roller coaster-like motion terrified both the passengers and the crew. The pilots tried desperately to stabilize the plane, but with all the hydraulic fluid gone, their controls were completely ineffective. No matter what they did, the plane wouldn't respond. The rudder on the tail fin was gone, leaving the pilots helpless, essentially becoming passengers on their own aircraft. As the plane continued to pitch and roll uncontrollably, the crew focused on the one thing they could still control: the engines. Stabilizing the plane using the engines alone was a huge challenge. In theory, they could turn the plane by using asymmetric thrust, speeding up the engines on one side while slowing them down on the other. They could also try to moderate the phugoid cycle by accelerating during a dive and decelerating during a climb. However, doing both at the same time was nearly impossible. Adjusting engine power asymmetrically could worsen the Dutch roll, and holding engine power steady to reduce the Dutch roll could worsen the phugoid motion. Amid the chaos, the pilots had not put on their oxygen masks. As a result, they began to suffer from hypoxia at altitudes between 20,000 and 25,000 feet. Deprived of oxygen, their brains struggled to understand what was happening and what they needed to do. For several minutes, they were little more than passengers, carried along by the unforgiving laws of aerodynamics. The plane was fundamentally out of control. Confused about why Flight 123 wasn't turning back to Haneda, the controller offered to guide them to Nagoya instead. The pilots, however, insisted on returning to Haneda. Noticing their struggle to communicate in English under pressure, the controller allowed them to switch to Japanese. Meanwhile, the pilots tried to understand what had gone wrong. "Is it to the rear?" Flight engineer Fukuda asked a flight attendant over the interphone. Only his side of the conversation was recorded. "What has been broken? Where?" So it's the baggage compartment, the furthest to the rear. Yes, I understand. Turning to the pilots, he said, "Listen, the baggage in the baggage compartment, the very rearmost part. The stowage space for baggage has collapsed. I think we better descend." However, the pilots had already been trying to descend for several minutes without success, possibly due to hypoxia clouding Fukuda's understanding. Even though there wasn't much air to breathe up there, the pilots on board made quick adjustments to the engine power, which helped reduce the up and down motion of the plane by half. Meanwhile, flight engineer Fukuda got in touch with Japan Airlines for advice because an alarm indicated that the rear exit door on the right side might be open. He thought maybe that was causing their problems. But despite their efforts, the plane kept bouncing between 20,000 and 22,000 feet, and it was veering away from major airports. Inside the cockpit, Captain Takahama and First Officer Sasaki were urgently trying to get the plane to descend. They were yelling commands at each other like, "Point the nose down!" and "Pull up!" and adjusting the engine power. To try to steady the plane, flight engineer Fukuda lowered the landing gear, which helped a bit but made it harder to control side-to-side movement. Finally, they managed to start turning the plane toward Haneda Airport using the engine power, but they couldn't stop the turn once it began. The plane ended up doing a scary 360-degree loop over a town called Otsuki, losing a bunch of altitude in the process. They even flew really close to Mount Fuji, scaring everyone on board. When they finally got the plane somewhat straightened out, it was way lower than it should have been, around 15,000 feet, and heading in the right direction. But it didn't last long. The plane started turning left and climbing steeply again. Air traffic control asked if they had things under control yet. Takahama replied, "Japan Air 123, uncontrollable." To his fellow flight crew he added, "This may be hopeless." Then suddenly, the aircraft plunged into another alarming descent, rapidly losing altitude. With mountains looming ahead, Flight 123 dropped to just 5,000 feet, dangerously close to the peaks. Captain Takahama urgently yelled for a right turn to avoid collision, commanding maximum power. Miraculously, the 747 climbed back to 8,000 feet, but the swift descent triggered a stall warning. Takahama, fearing a stall, called for maximum power once more. A frantic struggle then ensued to keep the plane from descending into the mountains. Takahama tirelessly directed throttle adjustments, shouting commands as the plane repeatedly climbed, stalled, dove, and climbed again. However, the engines and flaps responded sluggishly, making precise control impossible. The cockpit echoed with urgent cries of, "Nose up! Nose down! Flaps up! Flaps down! Power!" Meanwhile, the plane's erratic movements had left the crew disoriented. How far had they strayed from Tokyo? Which direction should they steer to return? The flight engineer sought answers from the controller. Tokyo ATC provided their position, 102 km northwest of Tokyo, which the crew acknowledged. This was the last anyone heard from the stricken plane. Disregarding further transmissions, they battled to keep the 747 above the jagged mountain peaks. Onlookers in the rugged terrain between Gunma and Nagano prefectures observed the aircraft weaving among the mountains. One captured a photo, revealing the plane's missing tail fin. The crew persisted until the end, refusing to surrender despite the odds. Banking sharply to the right, the 747 disappeared behind Mount Osutaka's descending ridge, vanishing from sight. In a steep spiral, Flight 123 plummeted towards the mountain, descending at a rate of 18,000 feet per minute with an 80-degree right bank. "Raise the nose!" Captain Takahama repeatedly shouted. "Raise the nose! Power!" As the right bank lessened, the plane began to pull out of the dive, but it was too late. The cockpit voice recorder captured Captain Takahama yelling, "It's the end!" At 6:56 p.m. and 22 seconds, the crash began. The plane's right wingtip and number 4 engine hit trees on a ridgeline and were sheared off. The aircraft continued forward, hitting another ridge with its right wing down, carving a deep trench through the summit. Debris tumbled down the mountainside as the wing disintegrated, but the 747 kept going, rolling onto its back and hurtling over 500 meters across a ravine. Finally, the jet slammed upside down into the spine of another ridge, causing an enormous explosion visible for miles. Large pieces of the plane rolled down the steep slope into the ravine, toppling trees and scattering burning debris over a vast area of forest. After 32 minutes of terror, Japan Airlines Flight 123 was down. Air traffic controllers watched helplessly as the plane disappeared from radar. They tried to contact the pilots but got no response. Just 1 minute later, their worst fears were confirmed when a Japanese military aircraft reported seeing a huge burst of flames in the Nagano Mountains. The U.S. Air Force had a plane nearby and offered to help search for survivors, even though it seemed unlikely there would be any. However, Japanese authorities declined this offer, preferring to send their own rescue teams to the crash site. By the time Japanese rescuers arrived, a full 12 hours had passed. Doctors on site said that passengers who could have been saved had succumbed to their injuries during this time. When rescuers reached the remains of the tail section, they saw an unbelievable sight. A hand, raised feebly from the wreckage, waving for help. It was off-duty flight attendant Yumi Ochiai, who had not only survived the crash, but also lived through 16 hours on the mountain waiting for rescue. Moments later, rescuers found another miracle. 12-year-old Keiko Kawakami, hanging from the branches of a nearby tree, injured but alive. Soon after, they found 2 more survivors in what was left of row 54, 34-year-old Hiroko Yoshizaki and her 8-year-old daughter Mikiko, both seriously injured but alive. Out of 524 passengers and crew, only these 4 people survived, all seated in the back of the aircraft. This number would likely have been higher if not for the disgracefully late response of the Japanese authorities. Because of this crash, Boeing made important changes to the 747's design. They redesigned the tail so pressure spikes wouldn't cause the same kind of failure that happened on Flight 123. They also improved the hydraulic systems by adding a fuse, so losing the tail wouldn't wipe out all 4 hydraulic systems. Japan Airlines changed their maintenance procedures too. They started supervising repair work more closely and doing more thorough inspections. The crash badly hurt the airline's reputation, and bookings dropped by over a third nationwide in the weeks after the accident. Flight 123 is still the worst single aircraft crash in history, but some good did come from it. The safety upgrades to the 747 and faster rescue efforts after crashes are direct results of this tragedy. Thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more like it, check out this one here. Please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video.